Um, what I want to do, I'm going to read a passage out of Hebrews 13. And I'm just going to tell you right now, I'm not actually going to preach on this passage, but this is really context on everything we've been talking about, okay? So, Hebrews chapter 13, book of Hebrews is in the New Testament. Towards the end, if you've got one of my Bibles, it's about page 1009. All right. So this is Hebrews chapter 13, verses 1 through 8. I was going to read through this earlier and just say, what do you see in here? But what I want to do now is I want to read it, and I want to invite you to think about how does this stuff in here kind of pertain to what we've been talking about, all right, and what we are talking about. So Hebrews chapter 13, verses 1 through 8. Let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Remember those who are in prison, as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you also are in the body. Let marriage be held in honor among all. Let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. Keep your life free from the love of money. Be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? Remember your leaders, those who spoke to you the word of God. Consider the outcome of their way of life. Imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Now listen, what he's doing there is he's actually giving them some instructions about how to live together. And what we've been talking about really is, what does Christian life together look like? And what I want to do over the next 2 weeks is give you my vision, what I think Christian life looks like. And I'm going to unpack it in 3 things, all right? But it's going to take us 2 weeks to do it. If you remember, if you were here, and I know some of you weren't, 5 to 6 weeks ago, I apologized for not teaching from a specific text. I'm going to do it again for the next 2 weeks. Not because I don't like any particular text, but it's because there's not one specific text that actually speaks to this specific topic. Hebrews 10 through 13 probably comes the closest in the New Testament, but what I'm doing here is I'm actually trying to synthesize all of the Bible's teaching, and I'm trying to pull out 3 threads that I think are really, really significant. So here's what that means. It means much of what I say is going to be speculative and it's going to be personal, and that means you're going to have to pay attention and you're going to have to decide for yourselves, does this resonate with how you read the scriptures and how you look at the world? Now, the big question that we've been asking for the past 5 to 6 weeks is really, what does it mean to belong? And then you can put in parentheses, to a small bivocational house church seeking the shalom of the city. All right? Now, we have answered that question, what does it mean to belong, by looking at core convictions, some of the things that are most central to us. And if you think about it, we've talked about friendship, that's pretty central. We've talked about Jesus, that's very central. Okay, we've talked about sin and shalom, and last week we talked about grace. All right? All of those things are very, very central to us, but I think you'd also find out there's actually a high degree of commonality in those things between us and between other churches. All right? You're going to find a lot of other churches that resonate with what we've said about those things. Okay? But now we're starting to look at some of the things that make us very, very different from other churches, very, very unique, and give us our own distinct flavor and personality. Kind of our identity. What does All Souls look like? We were talking to Nick last night, and I can't remember exactly how he said it, but it was insightful. He said, you can kind of, if you knew three bands, there's three bands that if you knew those bands, you would understand what makes me like who I am. And I'm like, that's actually really interesting. In other words, you guys could probably all name three bands, and they'd probably all be different. There's no right or wrong answer there. But what it does is the three things, whether it's bands, I don't know for me if it would be bands, I could definitely name three albums, okay, that for me are like, man, you understand those three albums, and you're probably going to understand a lot of what my emotional resonance is. Christian. Okay, well, you could look at bands, you could look at movies, you could look at books, there's all sorts of things, right? Well, listen, what if we took that analogy and just said, hey, what about churches? What are three things that if this church lost them, it wouldn't be the same? Or what are three things that once you see them, you start to understand the personality of a church? And it's not like that's necessarily right or wrong, it's just distinctives to us. Does that make sense? So here are the three things. And again, this is just my answer. You might have your own answer here, and that's okay. There's three things I think about All Souls that if you don't understand them, you won't get us as a church. And if you do understand them, you will get what makes this church, or at least what makes me, tick. All right, so here's the three things. We have a commitment to being bivocational. That's what I'm going to talk about today. We also have a commitment to being small and meeting in homes. Okay? And we have a commitment to seeking the shalom of the city. I'm going to talk about those second two things next week. Today I want to talk about bivocational. But I think that these three things together, bivocational, small or house, seeking the shalom of the city, when you understand what we mean by those things, it's going to capture the personality of All Souls and show you how we're thinking about pursuing life together. So that's where we're going. That's where we're headed this week and next. Three distinctives. Today's just the first. But before I jump into the bivocational thing, I need to give you a really important caveat. Okay? You don't need to throw papers all over, but I mean, you can. Okay. Really important caveat. It has to do with the difference between a value and a strategy, and then in parentheses I'm going to say in this little thing called a call. Value, strategy, call. Some of you guys have heard me ask the questions before, so this should be review for some of you. What's the difference between a value and a strategy? A strategy, so like if you're in business, you're trying to generate more sales, you put together this program, or like you're in school and you're like, okay, I've got a strategy for how I'm going to study, and you try to do the strategy and you get an F on the test and you're like, I think I need a new strategy, right? So a strategy is something you do, and if it works, you keep doing it. If it doesn't work, you jettison it and try something else. Okay? So you do it when it makes sense, you don't do it when it doesn't make sense. That's a strategy. What's a value? It's something you do even when it doesn't make sense. Catch that? There's certain things, like always being honest. There's times where it actually is going to pay, maybe not to be honest. But if honesty is a value for you, you're like, I'm going to be honest even if it hurts. You don't do it because it's strategic, you do it because it's right. That's the difference between a value and a strategy. Now I want you to think about what we've talked about with our core convictions. Take what we've said about friendship and authenticity. You don't have to share our convictions in order to be our friends, but we do have convictions. We're trying to go someplace. We talked about that. Does that sound like a value to you or a strategy? What do you think? Say value, okay? If it was just a strategy, like, oh, Emily, I want to be your friend. And it's not working? Okay, guess what? I'm over being your friend. We do not want a community like that, right? So friendship and authenticity, that's a value for us. Okay, let's try this again. This is like test time. Okay, our convictions about Jesus, that he's alive, that he rescues people, that he's building something, that he speaks, that he calls, that he equips, that he rules. Does that sound like a value or a strategy? What do you think, class? Okay, terrible. Emily failed, but that's okay. We love you anyway. It's a value, right? Okay. Think what we said last week, or 2 weeks ago, well, 3 weeks ago, about sin. Now, those of you who weren't here, I'm going to give you the real quick definition of it. A lot of people define sin as behavior. So if you think for a second, let's say this is you right in the middle. We tend to think of sin as like there's a set of bad behaviors over here. Don't do those. And then we think of faith as like, well, there's a set of things that you've got to believe over here. If you don't do the bad things, you do the right things, you avoided sin, you're okay. But the way we defined it was actually, it's not so much like a destination on either end, it's actually an impulse or a vector in either direction. So if you think about sin over here, don't think of sin as that thing over here. Actually, what were the things over here? We'd said had to do with self. So if you had self-focus, if you had self-assertion, if you had self-serving, if you had self-indulgent, if you had self-loathing, then any impulse in that direction, even if you didn't act on it, Jesus would say that's actually sinful. All right? Now the flip side is think about over here, rather than a specific set of like, oh, you just got to believe these checklist things, the focus over there, instead of being self, it's Jesus and it's kingdom. And Jesus is kind of like, unless you do these things for my sake. Do you hear the Jesus direction, the shalom direction? So what we said basically is the way the Bible defines sin and faith, they're actually opposite impulses. They work against one another. Sin is anything that's in the direction of self. Faith is anything that's in the direction of Jesus, the kingdom, and seeking shalom. All right? Now listen, that's a pretty big definition of sin. We saw that over the last 2 weeks or a couple weeks ago. Does that sound like a value or a strategy? It's a value. I mean, like that is a major, if we just think that's like, oh, we put it on, oh, it's not working so well, chuck it. That's huge implications. Let me give you one more. Last week's conversation about grace. God doesn't love you because you're great. He loves you because you're His. He's chosen you. And He says, we're going to get through this together. Again, does that sound like a value or a strategy? That's a value kind of thing. So everything up to this point fits into the value category. These things are the center of our universe. They are central to our faith. Now listen, I want you to think about this for just a second. What about bivocational? What about house church? Okay. What about seek the shalom of the city? Value. Okay, now before you, okay. Are these values? Because listen, how many churches are doing those things? Bivocational, house church, there's not many. Like if they're value level things, even seeking the shalom of the city, very few churches are really doing it very well. They'll tell you that. Okay? So they're probably not quite at the value level, but I'm not sure that they're quite at the strategy level either. For instance, I don't think that the bivocational, house church, seek the shalom of the city are things that, at least for me, that I could set aside. They're not incidental. They're more instrumental. And so what I really want is a word that's somewhere between, it's like not quite as heavy duty as value, but it's more heavy duty than just strategy. All right? And the word that I think fits that is call. Okay? Now here's what I mean. I can give you an example from the scriptures. You remember Peter and you remember Paul, right? In Galatians 2:8, Paul says, Peter was entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised. Who are the circumcised? Jews. But he says, I was entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, Gentiles. All right? So both apostles, Peter and Paul, have the same gospel. That's value, right? But each of them has different contexts and different strategies because they have different calls. Does that make sense? In other words, as Paul is doing his ministry, he's going to do some things that are very, very different than how Peter is doing them. And Paul doesn't look at Peter and go, that guy's such a loser. He's a lame brain. He doesn't know Jesus. He looks at him and he goes, no, he's got a different call. All right? But he looks at him and he goes, hey, listen, the way that I'm doing ministry, this isn't just strategic. This is actually a value for me. In other words, when you take the value and you kind of personalize it and say, this is a value for me, that becomes kind of this call thing. You think God's actually wanting you to do something in a particular way, so you're going to try to do it. So value, strategy, call. The reason I'm making this point and actually spending some time on it, it is really, really important that as I talk about these three distinctives, bivocational, house church, seek the shalom of the city, I think those are call level things. I don't think they're all the way up there in values. I don't think they're just strategic. But I also don't think other churches are wrong or bad if they're not pursuing them. You hear what I'm saying? It would be so easy as I talk about this to be like, oh, you go to a different church? You go to a big church that doesn't meet in houses? Pfft, you guys don't know Jesus. No. We want to be really, really careful. I think we need a huge amount of humility. Remember, a lot of this is speculative. There is not a specific passage in the scriptures that say, meet in homes. There's a handful of passages that say the church did meet in homes. But it doesn't say you have to do it. So we got to be really careful not to be critical of churches that are bigger, that meet all together in one place. All right? Can't do it. In the same way, we need charity. The kingdom is a big place. Everyone needs to personalize that sense of calling for themselves. So really what I'm giving you here is I'm trying to give you my sense of calling and why this matters to me. And what I want you to do is to think, well, what's your distinctives? What is your sense of direction that you think God is calling you into? And is there actually alignment? Because maybe you think God actually wants you to do something that would happen a lot easier in a big church. Then go to a big church and do it. By all means. Do you see what I'm saying? See here, the big caveat here? Be really, really careful as I talk about these things that make our church distinctive. That you don't hear me saying, our church is right and every other church is wrong. All right? I want to go on record. I want to be really clear about that. Okay, and we need to model that. And sometimes it's easy when you really like a band. And you're like, anybody that doesn't like this band just doesn't understand music. And it's like, no, you just really like the band, okay? It speaks to you. Same thing with what we're doing here. House church is a weird little niche. I think it may play an important role in the next 50 years in American Christianity. But listen, God works in all sorts of ways. And all sorts of people, and all sorts of places, all sorts of churches. So let's not be proud. Okay? All right, that's the caveat. Let's talk about bivocational. I was originally going to try to do all of this in 1 week. There's just too much to do in 1 week. Okay? So we're just talking about bivocational. Some of you may have heard another word called covocational. Have you heard that? If you haven't, don't worry about it. For all practical purposes, when I say bivocational, if somebody says, I like covocational, I'm like, okay, whatever, that's fine. Because my definition of either bivocational or covocational is a little bit different. It's a little bit more focused even than either one of those things. Bivocational, at the highest, simplest level, means that I have two areas in which I labor, two vocations. On the one hand, I'm a pastor of this little church called All Souls. Okay? I feel called to plant churches. On the other hand, I have a full-time job at this place called Lazarus. I feel called, I know, you've never heard it before. You ought to check it out. Okay? I feel that God has called me to make beer and start breweries and have have a job. Okay. The idea that I'm doing two things I've got like a work gig, and then I've got like a church gig. At its simplest level, that's what bivocational or co-vocational means. I've got multiple things. And specifically, I've got multiple things. I'm crossing that sacred, secular, I'm spending time in both worlds, all right? The church world and then the real world, where most of you live. I'm there. Okay. Seen from that perspective of what I just gave you, pastor, I've got 2 jobs instead of 1. I know some people that are like, I know pastors that are like this. They're like, oh, it's kind of a bummer that you have to have 2 jobs. I hope your church gets big enough someday that you'd only have to have 1. And what are they kind of implying has value there? Numbers. Well, like the church, yeah, numbers, so that you can do the church, because that's the really important thing. In other words, you're making beer at a brewery. That doesn't sound very important. Okay. I actually think that this bivocational thing, listen, is it strategic? Well, there's certainly some strategic value to it, right? Okay. In other words, I am meeting more and more pastors that are beginning to consider a bivocational way of doing things, but most of them are still coming about it from the perspective where they kind of see it as a means to an end. In other words, they look at the church and they go, church is struggling. It can't generate, most churches are really having a hard time paying all the bills, paying all the pastors, keeping the lights on. And so if pastors had other jobs, that would allow the churches to continue to do their thing. So they kind of see it as a strategic thing. It is, okay, it's not less than that. Most churches do face immense financial pressure. That actually creates pressure to grow numerically. You said it, Emily, it's numbers. You got to have people because you got to have giving. And that pressure influences everything you do. I can't emphasize this enough because none of you guys, I don't think anybody here has ever been like a full-time pastor in full-time ministry. When you are, you get a different perspective on what goes on. You see it from the inside out. One of my pastor friends used to say, you see the plumbing. All right? And you start to realize how many ministries are actually deeply driven. I think hearts are good, but they cannot escape the financial pressure. All right? And what it does, even when I planted our first church, I felt it. And I worked so hard not to be swayed by it. Guess what? You don't realize how much it colors and influences everything and everybody. Because you're always kind of thinking, are these the people that are going to help us get more folks so that we can actually be financially solvent so that I can get paid?
That's hierarchy of needs, right?
Yeah.
It's hard to focus on something else if you're worried about paying your bills.
Hierarchy of needs, hard to focus on something else if you're worrying about paying your bills at the end. Now listen, I'm not saying that to be judgmental. What I'm saying is this bivocational model, like when I tell pastors, we're a church of about 30 people, maybe 35, you count the kids, and we've been financially self-sustaining for probably 3 years now. We're supporting church plants, we're supporting Mercy stuff, and we've still got too much money in the bank. Most pastors are like, what? Okay, so there is a practical value to what we're doing here, but it's not simply strategic, all right? Let me unpack what I mean. When I used to work full-time in ministry, one of the things I discovered was that ministry sucks you in and that becomes your whole world. But when you have a full-time job, that keeps you embedded in the real world. And that is something that's deeply healthy for a pastor. I think it's good for pastors to know how to work, to know how to have, you have no idea how many pastors I know. This is really sad. I've met pastors who have they've been in the ministry for years. And do you know the reason why they haven't gotten out of ministry? Because they don't know how to do anything else. They're like, they say this, they confide it. They're like, I am spiritually dry. I am spiritually dusty. I don't feel like God has spoken to me for like 10 years. And I'm like, why are you still doing that? And they're like, I don't know how to do anything else. It's like, oh my goodness. That's appalling. So there's something that's really, really healthy about, like, look, we ought to know how to do work with our own hands and earn a living and do something that is valuable enough to the broader community that people would pay you to do it. Okay? They're like, I would gladly hand over money for the goods and services that you provide. Daniel, you run a cigar shop. That is valuable in this community. People pay you money for that. That's amazing. That's awesome. We need more. Okay, see what I'm saying? We need pastors that know how to do. What I found is that I started doing that. I'm like, wow. It frees me from financial burden, like worrying about the church in a financial perspective. And it actually allows me to do something really good in the community, but it keeps me grounded in the community. The people that you run into, Daniel, at your cigar shop are constantly reminded, like, this is not like they come in and they're like, let me tell you about the real, but they come in and they tell you their life and they tell you their stories and you start to get to know them. And what that's doing is that's taking all of the things that you believe and you think about on Sunday, but you're like, man, how does this speak to these people? And you may not say it, but you're thinking about it. Well, listen, pastors need that. And one of the challenges of conventional ministry is that it sucks us in, and the only people we talk to are the people we minister to, or the people that we work along. They're all Christians. They all say the same things. They think like us. And we live in a ghetto. All right? Now listen. Jesus did not just come rescuing people spiritually. Jesus spent at least half of his life learning a trade. Do you know what he was? He was a carpenter. He was an artisan. He learned how to build things. He learned how to make a living doing it. Even in his ministry, he heals people. He goes to parties. He hangs out with sinners. Jesus is neck deep in the world, and he cares about the world. He doesn't just care about people's spiritual needs. He has compassion on the physical stuff. He's like, I want to see this whole place redeemed. So for me, this bivocational thing is calling me into two worlds of work. I'm called to work in the world of ministry, forming Christian community wherever I am. But I'm also called to my job to work as unto the Lord. In that case, it's beer and coffee and tacos and joy in brick and mortar space. All right? And what that means is my work is valuable in its own right. It's not just a means to an end. It's not just a means to pay the bills or to help fund the church. It's not simply a way to get people into church. How well does that work? No, that's not the goal. It's a way for me to manifest kingdom values in the world in ways that people can appreciate even if they don't share any of my convictions. It's a way that people can get a taste of the kingdom. Most pastors that I know can't fathom how you do both of these things. Now, I've had to relearn how I do both of those things. But the fact that pastors can't fathom how you can have a full-time job and still be an effective pastor, I'll let you decide if I'm an effective pastor. I don't know if I am. But I know most pastors think you can't be that. And that means we've drawn some assumptions about what it means to pastor and what it means to work. Do you have any idea, some of you do, how good for me this dual calling thing has been? Now listen. I don't think it's just good for me. I think it's good for every single one of you. I think God calls every single one of you to have the same sense of bivocational, the same sense of dual calling. You have a calling to ministry, you have a call to work, to vocation. Two vocations. Now listen, this is a bold statement. I just took something I said is kind of personal and I kind of said I think it for all of you too. Is there any biblical evidence for that? Let me give you some. And again, remember, there's not like a specific passage that says it as directly as I'm saying it. You have to connect some dots here. So you're going to have to think about it for yourself. But think of it this way. Everything in the New Testament, think about everything that you know that the Bible says about spiritual gifts. You can think of some passages, right? Ephesians 4:12 says God gives leaders, that's apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers, to equip the saints. Who are the saints? They're not the leaders, the hoi polloi, ordinary people. All of you guys, okay? To equip the saints for what? The work of ministry. Building up the body. In other words, and the church knows this, churches know that it's not just staff people that are supposed to do the work of ministry. They know that everybody in the church is supposed to be doing work of ministry to build up the body of Christ, build up the church. Yeah, don't pull that. It's like, she's like, I can walk. I can pull things. This is my contribution. I'm going to pull the tablecloth out from underneath the candles. And you will never forget this sermon. You won't remember what was said in the sermon, but you'll remember the day the living room caught on fire. And it was like the Holy Spirit, except it was flames, like real flames. Okay, good job, Lily. Yeah, I know. Are you speaking in tongues now? Okay, here's my point. You can see in the scriptures where there's this idea that ordinary Christians are called to be building up the body of Christ. In other words, you've got a role in the church. Okay? But you can also see in the New Testament an awful lot about work. I'm reading a book right now that looks at that has actually done research on how much churches talk about work and vocation, and it's appalling. This guy went out and spent 3 years doing like statistical research based on sermons and stuff in print, and they're like, nobody talks, like churches are not talking about vocation. Guess what? The scriptures do. They actually talk about it in several places. Ephesians 4:26, let the thief no longer steal, do honest work with your own hands. Ephesians 6, slaves, obey your earthly masters as you would Christ. Work is unto the Lord. Now here's my point. There's a handful of passages. It's not like there's a ton of passages. But the point is there's a theme and there's this idea. If a Roman slave's work for their master could really be as unto the Lord, was slave work really valuable, redeeming, career rewarding work? No, not in the Roman Empire. All right? But he could say that could be done, even as you're digging ditches or whatever it is, that could be done as if you're working for God? And the answer is yes. What that means is God cares about your work. And if God cares about work for all of you, I think God cares about work for pastors too, right? My point is, you see that dual connection? I think you see both of those things in the scripture. Now listen, I can't prove it to you, but I think it's true. And I think churches haven't done a very good job of saying this bivocational thing is good for pastors and this bivocational thing is good for the people. I think we've emphasized, well, most of the time we've just emphasized ministry. Okay? Let me give you 5 implications really quick. I think these are gospel implications. I think they're good news implications. And then we'll do the Lord's Supper and we'll have lunch together. 5 implications for me, and I'm going to show how they may have an implication for you. All right? Number 1, my life is very busy. Like I work Monday through Saturday. And then I get up Sunday. Sunday's my day of rest. Okay? And it actually is. But here's the thing. I work 40 to 50 hours a week, plus I do church and ministry. You probably work 40 to 50 hours a week. Even if you're a mom. You work more than 40 to 50 hours a week. Yeah, if you're a mom. Okay. Listen. Here's what I want you to hear. This is actually how this is good news. Guys, my life, because I'm bivocational, actually has more in common with your life than it does with most ministry people. And what that means is, this is why it's good news, I'm actually really sympathetic to how busy your lives are. And I'm going to be really careful to ask you to do, like I do not ask people to do very much because I know how busy you are. And I think if you have a church where pastors and the people both appreciate how challenging and busy life is, it makes us think about like, what are we going to do? And let's make sure we don't do, like, let's not waste our time. All right? So that's the first implication. Life is busy. The second implication, this is really, it's similar. My life is full. Now here's what I mean by this. Before this, my old view, when I worked as a software engineer, I'd do all this work, 60, 70, 80 hours a week, But I didn't really feel like, where was God in that word? It's just, that's work. Where was God? God was in ministry. Okay, that's how I felt. And that's how a lot of people think. Like, what God cares about is the spiritual stuff. It's the ministry stuff. It's the Bible study stuff. It's this. And how much of that is your life? It's a really tiny piece. But if you actually start to believe that God cares about your work and your neighbors and your Christian community that you're forming, all of a sudden, when you look at your life, you see him everywhere. Like, I get up and I'm like, Lord, what do you need to tell me about Lazarus? Like, how do I, and I'm talking to him about really practical things. Like, how do I take care of employees? Do I do this thing? Do I not do this thing? What am I supposed to discern here? How do I hire this? How do I fill this role? Like, God's everywhere in my work, and he's everywhere in this work. And what that means is my life is full of God. There's very few corners where God's not doing something in it. And what that means is that same thing can be true for you too. And do you know why a lot of us actually feel like there's not very much God in our lives? Because we have kind of a truncated view of what God's doing and who he's doing it with. And the more you start to see him, now I know it's scary because you're like, I'm so busy, I don't know how I can possibly do more. We'll talk about that next. But my point is, when you start to embrace this bivocational view for yourself, your life's going to become full of God in a really good way.
Did that require a career change?
Did that require a career change? Let's talk about that over lunch. Okay, that's a good, because that's a really good question. Let's come back to that. Here's what it does mean. Okay, I don't know if this is required. It means I have to be really smart and selective. I'm constantly asking the question, you guys hear me, can I do this for the next 20 years? It needs to be sustainable. If I'm ever like, I don't think I can do this for the next 20 years, something needs to change this week. So what that means is I'm actually, I can't do everything. Guess what? Neither can you. And in most churches and in most work, you actually have a lot of pressure to just do everything, which is why you're so overextended. So one of the things this approach does, it gets you so deep in two places that you can't do that, and you know it. And so you actually have to get smart and selective about what you do. And what I want you to know is, I think that when a ministry builds on that foundation, it actually, you don't want to take advantage of people because you know they'll burn out and die and leave. And you're like, no, we got to be able to do this for 20 years. So I need to help you be smart and selective too. And that actually creates a really good ethos. Okay? It's not doing less. It's doing less, not more. It's doing smarter, not harder. It's listening, it's hearing, it's responding, it's focusing. Here's the fourth thing. That means there's a lot I'm not going to do. As your pastor, you've heard me say this. Get used to disappointment. Everything you expect from a pastor, I'm probably going to disappoint you. Because I know that I'm going to read and pray. I do that a lot. I'm going to do some hospitality. I'm going to get together when I'm asked. I'm going to do Sundays. I'm going to cast vision. I'm going to try to coach a few leaders. Marilyn and I will handle triage. If your marriage blows up, we're here for you. Okay? If shit hits the fan at work, we're here for you. But we're probably still going to try to connect you back to a leader and coach them through it. I'm not really going to lead groups. I'm not going to start Bible studies. I'm not going to do programming. I'm not going to organize things. All right? In some ways, All Souls is all about simple church, like slow food. Okay? Not sure what that. Fifth thing. That means there's a lot that you guys get to do. You've got the same bivocational calling, not just for your pastor, it's for you too. So there's some things you're going to have to do. Like, think about this. This model of church, I don't know what that buzz is. Oh well, I'm not going to worry about it. This model of church means like, I don't have the time to organize meals. Marilyn doesn't really either. So you guys are going, like, you're going to have to, and you guys already feel the weight of that a little bit, but it's like we have to all, if we all learn how to do some of these things, we can actually learn to do them. So there's things that I'm not going to do, but that means, okay, you are going to have to do some things. Hospitality, meals, you're going to have to show up, you're going to have to be kind of committed. Okay? But you also have the freedom to do and pursue what you want. So if you feel like a church needs something, great, do it. Okay? You feel like the church needs this, go for it. You feel like the church needs that, make it so. You feel like you want to start a group, I'm not stopping you. Okay? We're here to help, we're here to coach, we're here to provide a few guardrails, but the bottom line is this is a workbench where you can actually start to learn how to lean into both your work and ministry and how to do both of those things together. Okay? And I think that that opens up a world of possibilities for us. Questions to think about. Why has God put you here? What's His calling on you? What gifts has He given you to help form Christian community? What gifts has He given you to learn how to work for God in your regular work? Okay, where do you need help? Where do you want to grow? Who has He put around you to help you? Who has He put around you that you might be able to help? Are you approaching both your work and your church as a calling from God? Back to that Hebrews 13. Hospitality to strangers. Imitate your leaders. Some basic things. Okay? I think all of those are in this context. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling, and it is this full-orbed faith in Jesus. And what this means when you start to do this is you are going to experience God's presence and His purpose in every corner of your life. And that will make a big difference for you. The reason most people struggle with God spiritually, they don't sense much presence and they don't sense much purpose. Okay. That was a lot. Let me pray for us.